The heavy scent of wilting lilies and expensive floor wax clung to the air of the grand study in the Blackwood estate, a smell that would forever be associated in my mind with the day my life was supposed to end. I sat in the high-backed leather chair that had belonged to Silas for 30 years, feeling the coldness of the room seep into my bones despite the roaring fireplace. Across from me sat his two sons, Julian and Victor, men I had helped raise, men who were now looking at me not as the woman who had loved their father for a quarter century, but as an obstacle to be cleared away like rubble after a storm. The clock on the mantel ticked with a rhythmic cruelty, marking the seconds until I was expected to sign away my dignity and my home. They thought they were witnessing the final surrender of a grieving widow, but they had no idea that the ink in my pen was about to draw a map to their own destruction. The funeral had been a masterpiece of staged grief. Julian, the eldest at 46, had stood by the casket with a stoic expression that screamed of practiced nobility, while Victor, 3 years younger and always the more volatile of the two, had dabbed at his eyes with a silk handkerchief that probably cost more than a month of my groceries. I had watched them from behind a black veil, feeling a hollow ache in my chest that had nothing to do with their performance and everything to do with the man lying inside the mahogany box. Silas Blackwood had been a titan of industry, a man of sharp intellect and even sharper instincts, yet in his final months, as the cancer gnawed away at his vitality, he had become a ghost in his own hallways. I had been the one to hold his hand through the night terrors, the one to clean the bile from his chin, and the one to whisper promises of peace into his ear when the morphine could no longer dull the edge of the end. Now, only 3 days after the soil had settled on his grave, the wolves were at the door. Julian leaned forward, his hands clasped over a leather-bound folder that looked like a weapon. "Clara," he began, his voice carrying that patronizing lilt he used when dealing with subordinates, "we have spent the morning reviewing the primary estate documents with the legal team. It is a complicated situation, as you might imagine. Dad's business interests were sprawling, and his personal holdings were deeply intertwined with the corporate structure of Blackwood Holdings." I watched him, noting the way his eyes avoided mine, flickering instead to the gold watch on his wrist. Julian had always been a man of spreadsheets and bottom lines, a shadow of his father's greatness, but with none of the heart. Victor sat beside him, restless and smelling of expensive scotch and desperation. Unlike Julian's cold calculation, Victor's greed was a raw, pulsating thing. "We've reached a consensus," Victor added, his voice rasping slightly. "Given the current state of the market and the significant debts Dad accumulated during his private medical treatments, the estate needs to be consolidated immediately. The main house here in Greenwich, the coastal villa, in Monterey, and the majority of the liquid assets must stay within the family line. It's what Dad would have wanted." He was always a man who believed in the continuity of the Blackwood name. The family line. The phrase felt like a shard of glass in my throat. I had been Silas's wife for 25 years. I had been the one to host their graduation parties, to console them through their divorces, and to manage the household that provided the foundation for their lavish lifestyles. Yet in their eyes I was merely a temporary tenant, a biological footnote, who had served her purpose and was now surplus to requirement. "What exactly are you offering me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Julian slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a summary of a life reduced to a few clinical paragraphs. "You will receive a one-time payout of $250,000 from a secondary life insurance policy. In exchange, you will waive all claims to the real estate, the investment portfolios, and the family trust. We have also arranged for a small apartment in the city which the estate will pay for the next 6 months while you find your footing. $250,000. For 25 years of devotion. For the loss of the only man I had ever loved. For the home where every corner held a memory of a life built together." It was an insult disguised as a settlement. "And what about the medical bills?" I asked, remembering the astronomical costs of the experimental treatments Silas had insisted on. Julian's expression didn't flicker. Those bills were signed by you as the primary caregiver and spouse. Since the estate is being restructured to cover corporate liabilities, those personal debts remain your responsibility. It's a standard legal distinction, Clara. We're sorry it's a bit messy, but business often is. I looked at the number at the bottom of the paper. After the medical debts were settled, I would be left with less than $30,000. I would be 63 years old, homeless, and essentially bankrupt. They weren't just asking me to leave, they were sentencing me to poverty while they inherited a fortune valued at over $50 million. You want me to sign this now? I asked, my fingers tracing the edge of the heavy desk. It would be best for everyone, Victor said, his eyes bright with a hunger he couldn't hide. We want to move forward. We want to start the healing process, and that can't happen as long as these legal matters are hanging over our heads. We've even prepared a 30-day window for you to pack your personal items. We think that's more than fair. Fair. The word hung in the air like a bad joke. I looked around the study, at the thousands of books Silas and I had collected together, at the small photograph on the corner of the desk, showing us laughing on a boat in the Mediterranean, and at the two men standing before me, who shared his blood but none of his honor. I need 24 hours to think about it, I said. Julian sighed, a sound of profound annoyance. Clara, there's really nothing to think about. The documents are ironclad. Dad's old will from before your marriage is the one we are working from. He never updated the primary trust to include you. It's an unfortunate oversight, but the law is the law. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy, but my mind suddenly terrifyingly clear. I will give you my answer tomorrow. They left with a sense of triumph, their expensive shoes clicking on the hardwood floors like the sound of a closing trap. I stood at the window and watched their luxury cars disappear down the long, winding driveway, leaving me alone in a house that was no longer mine. The silence that followed was deafening, a physical weight that pressed against my chest. I walked to the small safe hidden behind a fake bookshelf in the corner of the room. Silas had shown me the code years ago, but he had told me never to open it unless I was truly alone. My hands shook as I punched in the numbers. Inside, nestled beneath a pile of old passports and property deeds, was a small, tattered envelope with my name written in Silas's cramped, elegant handwriting. Inside the envelope was a single key, an old-fashioned brass thing that looked like it belonged to a different century, and a note that read, "Go to the bank on 4th Street. Box 712. Don't tell the boys. I am sorry, Clara. I knew they would be like this." I sat on the floor of the study and cried for the first time since the funeral. I cried for the man who had known his own children so well that he had to plan for their betrayal from his deathbed. I cried for the 25 years I had spent trying to earn the love of two men who were incapable of giving it. And I cried for the woman I had been, the one who had believed that family was defined by something more than a bank balance. The next morning, the city of Greenwich was shrouded in a thick grey fog that felt like a shroud. I took a taxi to the bank, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The manager, a man who had known Silas for decades, led me into the quiet, sterile vault area. My hands were trembling so violently that I nearly dropped the key as I inserted it into the lock of box 712. The box was heavy, filled with documents that smelled of old paper and secrets. There were bank statements from accounts in Zurich and Singapore that I had never heard of, totaling more than $15 million. There were property deeds for a small house in the south of France and a ranch in Montana, both held in a private trust in my name. But the most devastating items were at the bottom of the box, a series of private investigator reports and a thick blue folder labelled "The Real Will." I began to read, and as I did, the world around me seemed to dissolve. The investigator reports were a meticulous record of Julian and Victor's lives over the past 5 years. They contained proof of Julian's systematic embezzlement from the family firm to cover massive gambling debts in Macau. There were photos of him meeting with men who didn't look like businessmen, exchanges of envelopes, and records of wire transfers to offshore accounts that were now being investigated by the SAC. Victor's file was even darker. It contained evidence of a series of fraudulent investment schemes he had run preying on elderly clients to fund his addiction to high-stakes real estate speculation. He was one phone call away from a federal indictment. Silas had known everything. He had watched his sons become monsters while he was still alive, and he had spent his final months ensuring they would never be able to destroy the one person who had actually loved him. The real will was a masterpiece of legal engineering. It didn't just leave the estate to me, it created a series of conditions that would act as a noose for his sons. It specified that if Julian and Victor attempted to contest the estate or remove me from the family home, they would be immediately disinherited and the evidence of their crimes would be turned over to the authorities. It also revealed that the mortgages on the primary properties had been secretly paid off years ago, and that the medical debts Julian had claimed were mine were actually covered by a private trust Silas had established specifically for that purpose. I sat in that quiet vault for 2 hours, reading every word, every line, every betrayal. My grief was gone now, replaced by a cold, hard clarity that I had never felt before. They had wanted to play a game of power and greed, and they had chosen the wrong opponent. When I returned to the house, Julian and Victor were already there, sitting in the dining room, with a bottle of Silas's best wine already open. They looked relaxed, the air of predators who had already tasted the kill. "Have you made your decision?" Clara Julian asked, leaning back in his chair with a smug smile. "We have the notary on standby." I walked into the room and didn't sit down. "I have," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, stronger and more resonant. "But before we sign anything, I think we should discuss the weather in Macaw, and perhaps your recent investments in the Sun Valley Project Victor." The silence that hit the room was absolute. Julian's glass stopped halfway to his lips, and Victor's face drained of colour so quickly it was as if a light had been switched off inside him. "What are you talking about?" Julian hissed, his voice losing its polished edge. I placed a copy of the investigator's report on the table. "I'm talking about the $15 million you funneled through shell companies to pay off the triads, Julian. And I'm talking about the 3 elderly women who lost their life savings because they trusted you, Victor." Julian lunged for the papers, but I stepped back, my eyes fixed on his. "Don't bother. Those are just copies. The originals are in a safe deposit box that will be opened by my attorney if anything happens to me or if I am forced to leave this house." Victor looked like he was going to be sick. "Claire, we can talk about this. We're family." "Family," I laughed, and the sound felt like breaking glass. "You stood in that study yesterday and told me I was worth less than a rounding error on a balance sheet. You tried to leave me with your father's medical debts while you divided up his life like carrion. You don't know the meaning of the word family." Julian was breathing hard, his mind clearly racing for a way out. "What do you want?" "I want you to listen," I said, leaning over the table until I was inches from his face. "Your father loved you once. He spent his life trying to build something for you, and you repaid him by stealing from him while he was dying. He knew what you were. He knew you would come for me the moment the dirt hit his casket. So he gave me the keys to your cage." I pulled out the real will and laid it on the table. "This is the will that was filed with a private firm in New York 6 weeks ago. It leaves the entirety of the Blackwood estate to me. The houses, the business, the accounts, everything." Julian grabbed the document, his hands shaking so much he could barely hold the pages. "This isn't possible." Sterling handled the will. "Sterling was on your payroll, Julian. Your father knew that too. He fired Sterling months ago and didn't tell you." Victor was sobbing now, a pathetic sound that made my skin crawl. "Please, Clara, don't do this. We'll lose everything." "You've already lost everything," I said. "You lost it the moment you decided that greed was more important than honor. But I am not like you. I am not going to leave you with nothing." I sat down then at the head of the table where Silas had always sat. According to this, will I have the power to grant you a yearly stipend from the trust. It's not much, but it's enough to live on provided you find actual jobs and stay away from the casinos and the scamming. The moment you attempt to contest this or the moment you contact me without my permission, the evidence of your crimes goes to the FBI. Julian looked at the papers and then at me. His eyes were full of a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. You think you've won, you're just an old woman in a big house. You'll be alone. I would rather be alone with my dignity than surrounded by monsters who share my name, I replied. Now get out of my house. They left that afternoon, not with the roar of luxury engines, but with the quiet, desperate scurrying of men who had been found out. I watched them go from the front porch, feeling a strange sense of peace. The house felt different now, no longer a tomb of memories, but a space of possibility. The next few months were a whirlwind of legal battles and restructuring. I worked with the new legal team Silas had appointed to ensure that the women Victor had defrauded were repaid in full. I used the Blackwood Foundation to establish a series of scholarships for underprivileged students, a project Silas had always dreamed of but never had the time to finish. I discovered a strength in myself that I had never known existed, a capacity for leadership and a resilience that had been forged in the fire of betrayal. I visited Silas's grave every Sunday. I didn't cry anymore. I would sit on the small stone bench and tell him about the garden I was planting, about the changes I was making to the company, and about the quiet joy of living a life that was finally my own. I knew he would have been proud, not because I had defeated his sons, but because I had refused to let their darkness extinguish my light. Julian eventually moved to a small apartment in New Jersey, working as a low-level accountant for a firm that didn't know his history. Victor disappeared into the interior of the country, reportedly working on a ranch in North Dakota. They were no longer the princes of Greenwich, but men who had to earn their bread for the first time in their lives. It was a harsh justice, but it was the only one they understood. One evening, as the autumn leaves began to turn the hills of Connecticut into a sea of red and gold, I sat in the study where it had all begun. The fireplace was crackling, and the room was filled with the scent of old books and fresh tea. I looked at the photograph on the desk, at Silas's smiling face, and I realized that he hadn't just protected me from his son. He had given me the greatest gift of all, the opportunity to find out who I was when the world told me I was nothing. The true inheritance wasn't the money or the houses. It was the realization that our lives are not defined by what we possess, but by what we are willing to protect. It was the understanding that even in the darkest moments, there is a path toward justice if we have the courage to find it. I picked up a pen and began to write a letter to the Foundation's board. I had spent 25 years as a wife and a stepmother roles that had been defined by my relationship to others. Now, for the first time, I was simply Clara, and that was more than enough. As the years passed, the story of the Blackwood inheritance became a legend in the city, a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed and the power of a woman's resolve. People would see me in town, a quiet, elegant woman who always had a kind word for the shopkeepers and a sharp eye for the details of her business. They didn't see the scars of the past, only the strength of the present. I realized that the lesson of my life was one that many people forget until it's too late. We think we can build walls of gold to protect us from the consequences of our choices, but gold is a soft metal. It bends and melts when the heat of the truth is applied to it. The only things that truly endure are the bonds of genuine love and the integrity of a soul that refuses to be bought. I had lost Silas, the man who was my world, but I had gained a sense of purpose that made that world larger and brighter than I had ever imagined. I had seen the worst of human nature in the sons I had helped raise, but I had also seen the best of it in the man who had loved me enough to fight for me from beyond the grave. The night was quiet now, the only sound the gentle ticking of the clock and the soft sigh of the wind in the trees. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the vast star-filled sky. I wasn't afraid of the future anymore. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was a woman who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and had come out on the other side with my head held high. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the many people who were currently facing their own betrayals, their own wolves at the door. I hoped that they would find their own brass keys, their own hidden safe deposit boxes of courage. I hoped they would realize that the ending of one story is often just the dramatic hook for the beginning of a much better one. I turned off the light in the study, but the warmth of the fire lingered in the air, a reminder of the heat that had forged my new life. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps firm and steady on the floors that would belong to me until the day I joined Silas in the quiet earth. And I knew with a certainty that reached into the very center of my being that I was finally home. The journey from a grieving victim to a woman of power had been long and painful, but it was a journey I would take again 1,000 times if it meant standing where I stood now. For in the end, we are not the sum of our tragedies, but the architects of our own redemption. We are the choices we make when the world is crumbling around us and the love we choose to carry forward when everything else is gone. The legacy of Silas Blackwood was no longer a shadow over my life. It was the foundation upon which I had built a cathedral of hope. And as I closed my eyes, I could almost hear him whispering in the silence, a voice full of love and a quiet, eternal pride. You did it, Clara. You finally found the key. The human spirit is a resilient thing, capable of blooming in the cracks of a broken heart. We are often told that money is the root of all evil, but that is a simplification. Money is merely a lens that magnifies what is already there. In Julian and Victor, it magnified a void that could never be filled. In Silas and me, it became a tool for a deeper kind of justice. I think of the lesson I would leave for those who come after me, the ones who will one day sit in their own high-backed chairs and face their own moments of reckoning. I would tell them that the greatest wealth you can ever possess is the knowledge that you have lived your life with kindness, even when it wasn't returned, and with strength, even when you felt weak. I would tell them that the shadows of the past can only haunt you if you refuse to turn on the light. My life is a testament to that light. It is a story of a woman who was supposed to disappear, but who chose to stand her ground instead. It is a story of how a dead man's love and a living woman's courage combine to create a legacy that will last long after the Blackwood name has faded from the headlines. I am often asked what I would do if I could go back to that day in the study, the day the boys came for me with their folders and their lies. I used to think I would change everything, that I would warn Silas earlier, that I would confront them sooner. But now I know that I wouldn't change a single second. That day was the birth of the woman I was meant to be. It was the moment I stopped being a supporting character in someone else's drama and became the hero of my own. The world is full of people who think that power is found in the ability to take from others. They are wrong. True power is found in the ability to give, to protect, and to endure. It is found in the silence of a house that is filled with peace instead of fear. It is found in the heartbeat of a woman who knows she is finally, irrevocably free. Now, as the final embers of the fire glow in the hearth, I am curious about you, the ones who have followed my journey to the end. What would you have done in my place? Would you have fought, or would you have walked away? Have you ever felt the weight of a brass key in your hand, waiting for the courage to use it? Comment below with the city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story of resilience has reached. Your story, like mine, is still being written. Make sure the ending is one you can be proud of. And remember, the people who try to destroy you are often the very ones who provide the tools for your greatest victory. The dawn will be here soon, and with it, another day of work at the foundation, another day of making the world a little more, just a little more kind. I will face it with the same strength I found in that bank vault, the same clarity I found in Silas's letter. For I am Clara Blackwood, and my story is just beginning. Thank you for listening to my journey. I hope it has given you a little bit of the light you need for your own. Until we meet again, stay strong, stay true, and never let anyone tell you that you are anything less than the master of your own fate.